Hi, this is Paul. I've been on Zoom all day long, and the last thing I really feel like doing is doing a video, but I know that I want to do this video, and if I don't do this video now, it might never get made, so we're going to do the video. One of the things I think about a lot is what we mean by this funny word, spirit. How it's meant different things. Again, this is so complex to talk about, but how even the thinking we do, we don't even know how others thought because we've only been able to think like we think, if that makes any sense. Maybe it's tired, I should just go home, but I really want to make this video, so maybe we'll see how much of this video I make. So one of the things I think about a lot is, if you'll notice, you listen to Jordan Peterson talk about animating spirits, you look at my conversation with Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke, my second conversation with Jonathan Peugeot that I probably want to revisit at some time is our conversation about angels and demons and spirits. And this, of course, has come up since Hermes has entered the corner. And so we really have to think about not just this word. We have to pay attention to how we use it. And we have to pay attention to what it means among us, because if you read the New Testament, you see, again, I've been going through the Gospel of Mark, you see Jesus the exorcist. There's a lot going on there that people have sort of dealt with shabbily, especially in the modern period, sort of dismissing things that they read in the Gospels as archaic ignorance or things like that. Now, when I talk about the recession of modernity, I know a bunch of you push back, and my favorite illustration of this is Mono Lake. And so here are a bunch of people at Mono Lake looking at all the little animalitos in Mono Lake, this very, very salty lake on the other side of the Sierra. If you go all the way through Yosemite, up over Tioga Pass, down this really amazing road down to the eastern Sierra, and then there's this lake. And for years, companies and water districts have been pulling water out of the feeder streams that fed the lake, meaning that the lake was no longer getting that fresh water. It's a dead end, and so the only way water leaves that lake is evaporation. But with all of the feeder streams getting water taken from it, the lake level went down, and when the lake level went down,